The first virtue theorist we'll look at is Confucius. He was born in 551 BC and died in 479 BC, and is of course still dead today. He lived in the state of Lu, which I'm probably horribly mispronouncing, and the general consensus is that he was probably from a noble family, but one that was impoverished. It is believed that he was self-educated, and it's estimated he had about 3,000 students in his life and about 72 close followers. And these may seem like tiny numbers today when you look at YouTube, etc., but of course no social media then, and there were of course quite a few fewer people during that time period. He lived during a violent and chaotic time, which is hardly surprising because pretty much we all live, and everyone's ever lived, in violent and chaotic times. In addition to his philosophical thoughts, he's also credited with preserving and editing many early works in literature, and that's another one of his claims to fame. In terms of his views about rituals and values, he faces the problem that humans always face, which is you have chaos and violence. How do you solve chaos and violence? And so what he looked for is a philosophical foundation for stability, both political and social. And his methodology essentially for doing this would be something that will sound familiar today and probably throughout all times, almost all times of course, is that the solution to today's problems is a return to a kind of a golden age. So he revived old rituals and values in the belief that these old rituals and values would revive society. And so the idea of like improving today through views of, things that were in the past is still common today. It's often seen as a conservative political standpoint, but of course liberals can do it as well, referencing back to usually a fictional golden age. Now, the golden age that Confucius seems to have referred back to was the time of the ancient sage kings who, going back, say, around 1000 BC, so quite a while before Confucius. And supposedly there were these sage kings who ruled not with force and violence, but with wisdom and moral virtue. And so this idea of referencing back to a golden age is, where people were more moral, more ethical, and that we need to return to this is, again, it's a very common view and pretty standard today. References even, for example, the political slogan, "Make America Great Again," kind of echoes that notion, referencing back to a better time. This is not to say that all references back to a past are equally the same, because you can have different moral conceptions about what the past was and what the present should be based on that. So a bit more background for Confucius. So in terms of him actually writing out his philosophy, apparently no. So the work that we have, the Analects of Confucius, I'm getting my horrible mispronunciations, is not a book he sat down and wrote out. So there are various, bad, attempts at humor, which begin with like Confucius say, and you may wonder, where does that come from? And the answer is, in kind of a bad translation of this work, it's the reason why it says that is because it's not that Confucius wrote this out and authored the work himself. His students put together his teachings, compiled them. And so that's why it says that he said this, because it's not him saying that he said it, it's his students saying that he said it, hence that reference. Now, key concepts in terms of his assumptions are this. One debate in moral philosophy is, of course, about what are humans naturally? Are people born good? Are they born bad? Are they born neutral? Or what? And virtue theorists are especially interested in this because they're all about, being a good person in terms of good character. And so how people are born has a huge impact on how morality would work and how moral education, which we'll look at in the future, would work as well. So a critical assumption that Confucius seems to have held is that humans are basically good. And his student Mencius took that and developed it even more. So Confucius is in the people are born good camp. Our good dead friend Aristotle, sorry, spoilers, is in the people are born neutral camp, and our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes, although I wouldn't say that people are bad, from kind of an intuitive view of people would be born kind of bad, basically selfish, self-interested, etc. And so they represent, kind of 3 points in the spectrum: born good, Confucius; born neutral, Aristotle; born bad, we would have Thomas Hobbes. Also, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who we'll look at, holds people to be born good and become corrupted. So what we should do, according to Confucius, is develop our goodness, because it needs to be developed like even if we're naturally inclined towards good or basically good, we can slide into evil or fail to develop it. And so we should develop our goodness to achieve virtue. How do we achieve this virtue? Well, we achieve it by paying attention to ritual, the correct rituals, not like bad rituals, and customs, ones that enhance virtue. And of course, the inner nature of things. And again, another big debate in philosophy across, metaphysics, etc., and epistemology are there things like built in? It's the put in pop culture terms, pop psychology, nature versus nurture. And Confucius definitely believes we have a nature that is good, but of course this nature can be nurtured badly or good. Key virtues include, some of the classics like righteousness, but also things like reciprocity and filial piety, basically, respect for one's family. There's also a critical part of this. Again, as I mentioned, even though Confucius is looking backwards, in a sense, to a golden age, to say that the current time can be fixed by getting back to these old values, it's critical for him that the rulers have to be properly educated and they have to be virtuous. And these virtuous rulers, like the models that he refers to, which may or may not have existed, as described, they would rule with wisdom and virtue, as opposed to force and violence. So merely looking back at the past is kind of a neutral thing. You could look back at, say, what could be considered to be a morally good past. Again, this all depends on what is the correct ethics, and your view depends on your moral view. So a person could look back at what they see as a golden age of virtue and wisdom and kindness and say we should be like that. Or someone could look back at a time of, say, authoritarianism, racism, inequality, and sexism and say, hey, we should get back to doing that. So merely looking back need not be the same look back to different things. In terms of his impact, somewhat not surprisingly, this great philosopher in his own time didn't have a huge impact. True, he had quite a few students, etc. But what often occurs is that in their own time, philosophers and artists and so forth are often not, terribly famous or seen as super important. It's often only long after their death that they're seen as being, really important and significant, and in the case of artists, having their works be very valuable. For example, Van Gogh, apparently when he was Van Goghing, when he was alive, his paintings weren't worth hardly anything. But now, long after his death, because of the way the art market works, if you were to happen to find an original Van Gogh, say, like at Goodwill or like in your attic, you could sell that for a lot of money, because now Van Gogh is considered, a very important artist. Similarly with philosophers, a kind of a similar thing. Philosophers that might have been well regarded and famous in their time now are obscure footnotes in the history of philosophy. Those that in their own time might have been more obscure could still be very obscure today or even more obscure, but now may be considered famous. In terms of why this is the case, some would say it's based on like their merit and quality. Others would say it's the same way success occurs almost anywhere. Once you have a certain base level of competence in a field, it's largely a matter of luck. In gaming terms, kind of like just rolling really well consistently. Now, in the case of Confucius, in his own time, again, had some students, had some followers, but not a huge impact. But his teachings eventually achieved dominance. And during the Han period, 206 BC to 220 AD, those teachings became orthodox. And then in what we now call China, they became the basis for these civil service exams. So the system was, again, oversimplifying, you want to look at the actual history and details, is the way you would get a position, a civil service position in the government was through passing these tests. And for the most part, they were the basis of these tests was Confucianism. We have something similar today in the United States. We don't have tests, we do have tests on Confucianism in ethics classes, but there are exams that can be taken for various, positions, and that's how you get them. It may not be like the sole or definitive factor, but many governmental positions do have these exams. And on the plus side, they're often seen as being more, fair, that anybody, can take the test, supposedly. And the idea being that the tests are supposed to be objective, supposedly, and by passing them, or doing well, a person could rise above the station at which they're born to be a success. And as you probably know, actual results will vary quite a bit. Now, Confucianism had official status up until 1911, when the communists, took control of China. And since then, it's not been part of the having official status. However, it still has a significant impact, not surprisingly, on culture and thought. Buddhism and Taoism, in addition to, of course, the official, philosophy, which is some form of communism. Not, if you looked at actual Marxism, etc., you'd say, wow, that's what they do is not that. But it's one of the major philosophies today. Now, so that's the introduction to Confucius. Next, we'll take a look at some more specifics about his views.